Ancient Greek civilization, the period following Mycenaean civilization, which ended about 1200 BCE to the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. It was a period of political, philosophical, artistic, and scientific achievements that formed a legacy with unparalleled influence. The larger historical period spanning from the output of ancient Greek author Homer in the 8th century BCE to the decline of the Roman Empire in the 5th century CE is known as classical antiquity, encompassing Greco-Roman culture, playing a major role in the Mediterranean sphere of influence and in the creation of Western civilization, and shaping areas as diverse as law, architecture, art, language, poetry, rhetoric, politics, and philosophy. The early Archaic period, the post-Mycenaean period, and Lefkandi. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece. The period between the catastrophic end of the Mycenaean civilization and about 900 BCE is often called a Dark Age. It was a time about which Greeks of the classical age had confused and actually false notions. Thucydides, the great ancient historian of the 5th century BCE, wrote a sketch of Greek history from the Trojan War to his own day, in which he notoriously fails, in the appropriate chapter, to signal any kind of dramatic rupture. He does, however, speak of Greece settling down gradually and colonizing Italy, Sicily, and what is now Western Turkey. This surely implies that Greece was settling down after something. Thucydides does indeed display sound knowledge of the series of migrations by which Greece was resettled in the post-Mycenaean period. The most famous of these was the Dorian invasion, which the Greeks called, or connected with, the legendary return of the descendants of Heracles. Although much about that invasion is problematic, it left little or no archaeological trace at the point in time where tradition puts it. The problems are of no concern here. Important for the understanding of the archaic and classical periods, however, is the powerful belief in Dorianism as a linguistic and religious concept. Thucydides casually but significantly mentions soldiers speaking the Doric dialect in a narrative about ordinary military matters in the year 426. That is a surprisingly abstract way of looking at the subdivisions of the Greeks, because it would have been more natural for a 5th century Greek to identify soldiers by home cities. Equally important to the understanding of this period is the hostility to Dorians, usually on the part of Ionians, another linguistic and religious subgroup, whose most famous city was Athens. So extreme was this hostility that Dorians were prohibited from entering Ionian sanctuaries. Extant today is a 5th century example of such a prohibition, an inscription from the island of Paros. Phenomena such as the tension between Dorians and Ionians that have their origins in the Dark Age are a reminder that Greek civilization did not emerge either unannounced or uncontaminated by what had gone before. The Dark Age itself is beyond the scope of this article. One is bound to notice, however, that archaeological finds tend to call into question the whole concept of a Dark Age, by showing that certain features of Greek civilization once thought not to antedate about 800 BCE can actually be pushed back by as much as 2 centuries. One example, chosen for its relevance to the emergence of the Greek city-state, or polis, will suffice. In 1981, archaeology pulled back the curtain on the darkest phase of all, the proto-geometric period, c. 1075–900 BCE, which takes its name from the geometric shapes painted on pottery. A grave, rich by the standards of any period, was uncovered at a site called Lefkandi on Euboea, the island along the eastern flank of Attica, the territory controlled by Athens. The grave, which dates to about 1000 BCE, contains the probably cremated remains of a man and a woman. The large bronze vessel in which the man's ashes were deposited came from Cyprus, and the gold items buried with the woman are splendid and sophisticated in their workmanship. Remains of horses were found as well. The animals had been buried with their snaffle bits. The grave was within a large collapsed house, whose form anticipates that of the Greek temples 2 centuries later. Previously, it had been thought that those temples were one of the first manifestations of the monumentalizing associated with the beginnings of the city-state. Thus, that find and those made in a set of nearby cemeteries in the years before 1980, attesting further contacts between Egypt and Cyprus between 1000 and 800 BCE, are important evidence. They show that one corner of one island of Greece, at least, was neither impoverished nor isolated in a period usually thought to have been both. The difficulty is to know just how exceptional Lefkandi was, but in any view it has revised former ideas about what was and what was not possible at the beginning of the first millennium BCE. Quick facts. Date 1200 BCE, 323. Major events: Hellenistic Age, Greco-Persian Wars, Trojan War, Peloponnesian War, Classical Antiquity. Key people: Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Euripides, Pericles. Related topics: Olympic Games, Greek philosophy, Greek religion, Greek mythology, neoclassical art. Related places: Peloponnese, Pergamum, Attica, Magna Graecia, Trabzon. Colonization and city-state formation. The term colonization, although it may be convenient and widely used, is misleading. When applied to archaic Greece, it should not necessarily be taken to imply the state-sponsored sending out of definite numbers of settlers, as the later Roman origin of the word implies. For one thing, it will be seen that state formation may itself be a product of the colonizing movement. The Olympic Games. Olympic medals hang against a blurry background, one of two. What is the history of the Olympics? The first Olympic Games consisted of a singular event, a foot race. See all videos for this article. How did a corpse win an ancient Olympic event? 2 of 2. How did a corpse win an ancient Olympic event? Learn interesting facts about ancient Greek sports. See all videos for this article. The first date in Greek history is 776 BCE, the year of the first Olympic Games. It was computed by a 5th century BCE researcher called Hippias. He was originally from Elis, a place in the western Peloponnese in whose territory Olympia itself is situated. This date and the list of early victors, transmitted by another literary tradition, are likely to be reliable, if only because the list is so unassuming in its early reaches. That is to say, local victors predominate, including some Messenians. Messene lost its independence to neighboring Sparta during the course of the 8th century, and this fact is an additional guarantee of the reliability of the early Olympic victor list. Messenian victors would hardly have been invented at a time when Messene, as a political entity, had ceased to exist. Clearly then, record-keeping and organized activity involving more than one community and centering on a sanctuary, such as Olympia, go back to the early 8th century. Such competitive activity is an example of what has been called peer-polity interaction. Records imply a degree of literacy, and there too the tradition about the 8th century has been confirmed by late 20th century finds. A cup bearing the inscription in Greek in the Euboean script, "I am the cup of Nestor," can be securely dated to before 700 BCE. It was found at an island site called Pithecusae, Ischia, on the Bay of Naples. Overseas projects. The early overseas activity of the Euboeans has already been remarked upon in connection with the discoveries at Lefkandi. They were the prime movers in the more or less organized, or at any rate remembered and recorded, phase of Greek overseas settlement, a process known as colonization. Euboean priority can be taken as absolutely certain because archaeology supports the literary tradition of the Roman historian Livy and others. Euboean pottery has been found both at Pithecusae to the west and at the Turkish site of Almina to the east. This more organized phase began in Italy about 750 and in Sicily in 734 BCE. Its episodes were remembered, perhaps in writing, by the colonies themselves. The word organized needs to be stressed, because various considerations make it necessary to push back beyond that date the beginning of Greek colonization. First, it is clear from archaeological finds, such as the Lefkandi material, and from other new evidence that the Greeks had already, before 750 or 734, confronted and exchanged goods with the inhabitants of Italy and Sicily. Second, Thucydides says that Dark Age Athens sent colonies to Ionia, and archaeology bears this out, however much one discounts for propagandist exaggeration by the imperial Athens of Thucydides' own time of its prehistoric colonizing role. However, after the founding of Cumae, a mainland Italian offshoot of the island settlement of Pithecusae, about 750 BCE, and of Sicilian Naxos and Syracuse in 734 and 733. Respectively, there was an explosion of colonies to all points of the compass. The only exceptions were those areas, such as Pharaonic Egypt or Inner Anatolia, where the inhabitants were too militarily and politically advanced to be easily overrun. One may ask why the Greeks suddenly began to launch these overseas projects. It seems that commercial interests, greed, and sheer curiosity were the motivating forces. An older view, according to which archaic Greece exported its surplus population because of an uncontrollable rise in population, must be regarded as largely discredited. In the first place, the earliest well-documented colonial operations were small-scale affairs, too small to make much difference to the situation of the sending community, the metropolis or mother city. That is certainly true of the colonization of Cyrene in North Africa from the island of Thera, Santorin. On this point, an inscription has confirmed the classic account by the 5th century Greek historian Herodotus. In the second place, population was not uncontrollable in principle. Artificial means such as infanticide were available, not to mention more modern techniques like contraception. Considerations of this kind much reduce the evidential value of discoveries establishing, for example, that the number of Grave in Attica and the Argolid, the area around Argos, increased dramatically in the later Dark Age, or that there was a serious drought in 8th century Attica. That is the admitted implication of a number of dried-up wells in the Athenian agora or civic center. In fact, no single explanation for the colonizing activity is plausible. Political difficulties at home might sometimes be a factor, as for instance at Sparta, which in the 8th century sent out a colony to Tarentum, in Italy, as a way of getting rid of an unwanted half-caste group. Nor can one rule out simple craving for excitement and a desire to see the world. The lyric poetry of the energetic and high-strung poet Archilochus, a 7th century Parian involved in the colonization of Tharsos, shows the kind of lively-minded individual who might be involved in the colonizing movement. So far, the vague term community has been used for places that sent out colonies. Such vagueness is historically appropriate, because those places themselves were scarcely constituted as united entities, such as a city or polis. For example, it is a curious fact that Corinth, which in 733 colonized Syracuse in Sicily, was itself scarcely a properly constituted polis in 733. The formation of Corinth as a united entity is to be put in the second half of the 8th century, with precisely the colonization of Syracuse as its first collective act. The beginnings of the polis. The name given to polis formation by the Greeks themselves was synarchismos, literally a gathering together. Synarchismos could take one or both of two forms. It could be a physical concentration of the population in a single city or an act of purely political unification that allowed the population to continue living in a dispersed way. The classic discussion is by Thucydides, who distinguishes between the two kinds of synarchismos more carefully than do some of his modern critics. He makes the correct point that Attica was politically syncretized at an early date, but not physically syncretized until 431 BCE, when Pericles, as part of his war policy, brought the large rural population behind the city walls of Athens. A more extreme instance of a polis that was never fully syncretized in the physical sense was Sparta, which, as Thucydides elsewhere says, remained settled by villages in the old Greek way. It was an act of conscious arrogance, a way of claiming to be invulnerable from attack, and not to need the walls that Thucydides again and again treats as the sign and guarantee of civilized polis life. The urban history of Sparta makes an interesting case history showing that Mycenaean Sparta was not so physically or psychologically secure as its Greek and Roman successors. The administrative center of Mycenaean Sparta was probably in the Parnon Mountains at the excavated site of the Menelaean. Then archaic and classical Sparta moved down to the plain. Byzantine Sparta, more insecure, moved out of the plain again to perch on the site of Mistra on the opposite western mountain, Taygetos. Finally, modern Sparta is situated, once again peacefully and confidently, on its old site on the plain of the river Eurotas. The enabling factors behind the beginnings of the Greek polis have been the subject of intense discussion. One approach connects the beginnings of the polis with the first monumental buildings, usually temples like the great early 8th century temple of Hera on the island of Samos. The concentration of resources and effort required for such constructions presupposes the formation of self-conscious polis units and may actually have accelerated it. As stated above, however, the evidence from Lefkandi makes it hard to see the construction of such monumental buildings as a sufficient cause for the emergence of the polis, a process or event nobody has yet tried to date as early as 1000 BCE. Another related theory argues that the birth of the Greek city was signaled by the placing of rural sanctuaries at the margins of the territory that a community sought to define as its own. That theory fits admirably a number of Peloponnesian sanctuaries. For instance, the temple complex of Hera staked out a claim, on the part of relatively distant Argos, to the plains stretching between city and sanctuary, and the Corinthian sanctuary on the promontory of Pericora, also dedicated to Hera, performed the same function. Yet there are difficulties. It seems that the Isthmia sanctuary, which at first sight seems a good candidate for another Corinthian rural sanctuary, was already operational as early as 900 BCE in the proto-geometric period, and that date is surely too early for polis formation. Nor does the theory easily account for the rural temple of the goddess Aphia in the middle of Aegina. The sanctuary is admittedly a long way from the town of Aegina, but Aegina is an island, and there is no obvious neighbor against whom territorial claims could plausibly have been asserted. Finally, a theory that has to treat the best-known polis, namely Athens and Attica, as in every respect exceptional, is not satisfactory. There is no Athenian equivalent of the Argive Herium. A third theory attacks the problem of the beginnings of the polis through burial practice. In the 8th century, it is said, formal burial became more generally available, and that democratization of burial is evidence for a fundamentally new attitude toward society. The theory seeks to associate the new attitude with the growth of the polis. There is, however, insufficient archaeological and historical evidence for that view, which involves an implausible hypothesis that the process postulated was discontinuous and actually reversed for a brief period at a date later than the 8th century. Moreover, it is vulnerable to the converse objection as that raised against the second theory. The evidence for the third theory is almost exclusively Attic, and so even if it were true, it would explain Athens and only Athens. Fourth, one may consider a theory whose unspoken premise is a kind of geographic determinism. Perhaps the Greek landscape itself, with its small alluvial plains, often surrounded by defensible mountain systems, somehow prompted the formation of small and acrimonious polis, endlessly going to war over boundaries. That view has its attractions, but the obvious objection is that, when Greeks went to more open areas such as Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, they seem to have taken their animosities with them. That in turn invites speculations of a psychologically determinist sort. One has to ask, without hope of an answer, whether the Greeks were naturally particularist. A fifth enabling factor that should be borne in mind is the influence of the colonizing movement itself. The political structure of the metropolis or sending city may sometimes have been inchoate. The new colony, however, threatened by hostile native neighbors, rapidly had to get its act together if it was to be a viable cell of Hellenism on foreign soil. That effort in turn affected the situation in the metropolis, because Greek colonies often kept close religious and social links with it. A 4th century inscription, for instance, attests close ties between Miletus and its daughter city Olbia in the Black Sea region. Here, however, as so often in Greek history, generalization is dangerous. Some mother-daughter relationships, like that between Corinth and Corcyra, Corfu, were bad virtually from the start. A related factor is Phoenician influence, related, because the early Phoenicians were great colonizers who must often have met trading Greeks. The Phoenician coast was settled by communities similar in many respects to the early Greek polis. It is arguable that Phoenician influence and Semitic influence generally on early Greece has been seriously underrated. Theories such as these are stimulating and may each contain a particle of truth. The better position, however, is that generalization itself is as yet premature. In particular, archaeologically based theoretical reconstructions need much more refining. All one can say in summary is that in roughly the same period, namely the 8th century, a number of areas such as Corinth and Megara began to define their borders, deny autonomy to their constituent villages, and generally act as separate states. Attica's political cynicism, which occurred a little earlier, was complete perhaps about 900. Tempting though it is to seek a single explanatory model for those very roughly contemporaneous processes, one should perhaps allow that different paths of development were followed in different areas, even in areas next door to each other. After all, the archaic and classical histories of mighty democratic imperial Athens, of the miserable polis of Megara, which nevertheless colonized Byzantium, of wealthy, oligarchic Corinth, and of federal Boeotia were all very different, even though Athens, Megara, Corinth, and Boeotia were close neighbors. One is perhaps on firmer ground when one examines the evidence for Propolis aggregations of larger units, often religious in character. There are a number of such associations whose origins lie in the Dark Age and whose existence surely promoted some feeling of local and particularist identity among the participants. The Ionians in Anatolia formed themselves into a confederation of 12 communities, the Ionian Dodecapolis, with a common meeting place, and there were comparable groupings among the Dorian Greeks of Anatolia and even among the Carians, partially Hellenized non-Greeks, in the same part of the world. The central location for such organizations was characteristically small and insignificant. A poorly attested but intriguing early archaic league was the Calorian Amphictyony. An Amphictyony was a religious league of dwellers round about. Caloria, the small island now called Poros, was not a place of any consequence in itself, but the league's 7 members included Athens and Aegina, 2 major Greek polis. The most famous and enduring such Amphictyony, however, was the one that, originally from a distance, administered the affairs of the sanctuary of Delphi in central Greece. That sanctuary contained the most famous, though not the oldest, Greek oracle. The oldest was at Dodona. Oracles were a mechanism by which divinely inspired utterances were produced in answer to specific questions. Finally, it is worth noting an adventurous suggestion that Lefkandi itself might have been the center of some kind of religious amphictyony. But if so, this would be an exception to the principle that religious centers tended themselves to be insignificant, however mighty their participating members. Early archaic Greek civilization. The sources: Ancient Greece, from Philip II to the Roman Empire. Ancient Greece, from Philip II to the Roman Empire. An overview of ancient Greek civilization. See all videos for this article. Before attempting to characterize archaic Greece, one must admit candidly that the evidence is unsatisfactory. Only for Athens is anything like a proper political tradition known, and Athens' development toward the democracy of the 5th century was amazingly and untypically rapid by comparison with other states, many of which never became democratic at all. A tiny but salutary scrap of evidence makes this point. Thucydides, in Book II of his History of the Peloponnesian War, casually mentions a man called Avarchus as tyrant of a small northwestern Greek polis called Astacus in the 420s BCE. But for this chance mention, one would never have guessed that tyranny could have existed or persisted in such a place so late or so long. Another difficulty is that, while a fair amount about the social structure of classical Athens is known, some of it must go back to archaic times. Just how much is disputed. There is a further complication. In both the political and the social spheres, one has to reckon, chiefly at Athens, but elsewhere too, with invented tradition, a distorting element for which proper allowance is only now beginning to be made. Thus it seems that not just Lycurgus, the famous Spartan lawgiver, whose historicity was doubted even in antiquity, but even a reforming figure like Solon of Athens, who certainly existed in the 6th century and large fragments of whose poetry still survive, was in some respects what anthropologists call a culture hero. Much was projected onto him anachronistically or just wrongly, and reformers in later generations established their credentials by claiming, if they were reactionaries, that they were trying to get back to Solon, or if they were Democrats, that Solon was their founding father. Such errors should not induce too much pessimism. At Athens, at least, individual aristocratic families preserved oral traditions, which affected the later literary records in ways that can be properly understood with the help of anthropological analogy. That is to say, not all the evidence so preserved is unusable, but it needs handling in special ways. It has even been argued that social life too was creatively manipulated. Later Greek cities contained, alongside such transparent political institutions as the popular assembly and the deliberative, probouleutic council, a more opaque set of institutions, ostensibly based on kinship groupings. The biggest and most basic of these groupings were the phylli, or tribes, according to which the citizen body was subdivided. Thus, all Dorian states had the same 3 tribes, and there were 4 Ionian tribes, although Ionian states were less conservative than Dorian, and one finds among them a greater readiness to innovate. Late 6th century Athens, for example, switched from a 4-tribe hereditary system of citizenship to a 10-tribe one based on simple residence as well as descent. Smaller subdivisions were the phratri, a word connected with a philological root meaning brother, and the genos, a smaller cluster of families, oik. The existence of these groupings in historical times is beyond question. One finds them controlling citizen intake, as in the so-called Demotionidae inscription from the Attic village of Decelia, datable to as late as the early 4th century BCE, and entering into complicated property arrangements. What has become a matter of debate, however, is the question of just how old they actually were. According to the most skeptical view, the whole apparatus of tribe and genos was an invention without any Dark Age history to legitimate it. This view, which rests partly on the near absence of the relevant kinship terminology in Homer, is not ultimately convincing in its hypothesis of a kind of complicated collective fraud on posterity. Yet it is right to allow for an element of conscious antiquarianism at certain periods, the 320s in Athens being one, which may well have affected specific traditions. Society and values. Bacchiadi and Eupatridae. The world of the colonizing states was aristocratic in the sense that a small number of exclusive clans within cities monopolized citizenship and political control. At Corinth, for example, political control was monopolized by the adult males of a single clan, the Bacchiadi. They perhaps numbered no more than a couple of hundred. At Athens, there was a general class of Eupatridae, a word that just means people of good descent, i.e., aristocrats. The word may have had a simultaneous but narrower application to one single genos. This, however, is disputed, and in any event, that hypothetical family was only one among many privileged gene. The case, therefore, is not analogous to that of the Bacchiadi. It is unlikely that the Eupatridae were as rigidly defined as the Bacchiadi, and the negative tradition that Solon in the early 6th century deprived them of their exclusive claim to political office may just be the excessively formal and precise way in which later ancient commentators described a positive change, by which power was made more generally available than it had been before. Marble bust of Alexander the Great in the British Museum, London, England, Hellenistic Greek, 2nd 1 century BC, said to be from Alexandria, Egypt, height 37 cm. Britannica quiz. Ancient Greece. With regard to those same early archaic times, one hears, for example, in the poetry of the 7th century Boeotian Hesiod, of control, sometimes oppressively exercised by Basileus singular Basilius. That word is usually translated as kings, and such titles as the Athenian Basilius, an official or archon with a defined religious competence, conveniently but less correctly called the Archon Basilius by modern scholars, are then explained as survivals of an age of monarchy. That account in terms of fossilization certainly eases the awkwardness of explaining why, for instance, the wife of the Archon Basilius was held to be ritually married to the god Dionysus. The very existence of kingship in geometric, as opposed to Mycenaean Greece, however, has been challenged, and a case has been made though not universally accepted, for seeing most of those archaic basileis not as kings in any sense, but as hereditary nobles. In the latter case, there is no great difference between those basileis and such aristocrats as the Bacchiadi. Symposia and gymnasia. Life inside the archaic Greek societies ruled by such families can be reconstructed only impressionistically and only at the top of the social scale. The evidence, to an extent unusual even in Greco-Roman antiquity, is essentially elitist in its bias. Aristocratic values were transmitted both vertically, by family oral traditions, and horizontally, by means of a crucial institution known as the symposium or feast, for which many literary scholars now believe much surviving archaic poetry was originally written. Perhaps much fine painted pottery was also intended for that market, though the social and artistic significance of such pottery is debated. Some scholars insist that the really wealthy would at all times have used gold and silver vessels, which, however, have not survived in any numbers because they were melted down long ago. Symposia were eating and dining occasions with a strong ritual element. Their existence is reflected in the marked emphasis, in the Homeric poems, on ostentatious feasting and formal banqueting as assertions of status, what have been called feasts of merit. Thus, Sarpedon in Homer's Iliad reminds Glaucus that both of them are honored with seats of honor and full cups in Lycia, and with land, a sacred precinct, or temenos, to finance all the feasting. Symposia were confined to males, a reminder of the military ethos so prevalent in Homer. Although when the institution was introduced, along with the vine, to Etruria, where much of the visual evidence comes from, it changed its character and became open to both sexes. The Greek symposium proper can be seen as an instrument of social control. It is a more tangible unit of social organization, and one with better attested Homeric antecedents than the problematic gene or phratries discussed above. In classical times, strong homosexual attachments were another way in which values were inculcated, passed on by the older man, the Erastes, to the younger Eromenos or beloved. The gymnasium was the venue where such relationships typically developed. As with the symposium, there was an almost ritual element to it all. Certain gifts, such as, for example, the gift of a hair, were thought especially appropriate. The date, however, at which Greek homosexuality became a central cultural institution is problematic. It is notoriously absent from the Homeric poems, a fact that some scholars explain as being the result of poetic reticence. The more plausible view is that homosexuality was in some way connected with the rise of the polis and was part of what has been called the 8th century Renaissance. If so, Homer's silence is after all significant. He does not mention it because in his time it was not yet important. Both symposia and gymnasia in different ways mirrored or were preparatory to warfare. See below. Interpolis athletic competitions, such as the Olympic Games, are another reflection of warfare. Epinician poetry of the classical period, that is, victory poetry, like that of Pindar, whose Epinician odes celebrate the athletic victories of aristocratic individuals, constantly uses the language of war, fighting, and victory. Indeed, one influential view of organized athletic competitions is that they are a restructuring of the instinct to hunt and kill. Formal relationships. With the great athletic festivals, which brought Greeks together at set intervals of years to Olympia and later to Delphi, Nemea, and the Isthmus, the four great Panhellenic or all-Greek games, one passes from the internal organization of individual Greek societies to their interrelationships. Two kinds of powerful interrelationship have already been noted, that between colonizing or mother city and daughter city and the shared membership of an amphictyony. Mythical links between one city and another were maintained and exploited throughout all periods by a process which has been felicitously called kinship diplomacy. The most common such link was that between mother and daughter city and involved the stressing of shared ancestry, that is, common descent from some mythical hero or founder figure. Such kinship diplomacy was taken very seriously by all parties, and as late as the Hellenistic period was the basis for alliances or other sorts of common action. Modern historians tend to stress the particularism of Greek culture, i.e., the separate development and carefully cultivated local identity of the individual polis. Networks of kinship diplomacy were one means by which this particularism was softened in practice. At the individual level, the basic institution in intercity relationships was that of guest friendship or xenia. That was another area where ritual elements were present to such a marked degree that the whole institution has been called ritualized friendship. The same aristocrats who drank and heard poetry together inside their own communities naturally expected to find comparable groups inside other states. They cemented their ties, which had perhaps been formed on initially casual or trading visits, with formal relationships of xenia. At some point quite early in the archaic period, that institution developed into something still more definite, the proxenia. Proxenoi were citizens of state, living in state A, who looked after the interests of citizens of state B. The status of proxenos was surely in origin hereditary, but by Thucydides' time, one hears of voluntary proxenoi, ethyloproxeno. The antiquity of the basic institution is not in doubt, however much the 5th century Athenian Empire may have exploited and reshaped it for its own political convenience. A 7th century inscription from the island of Corcyra mentioning a proxenos from Locris is the earliest attestation of the institution. Another way of institutionalizing relationships between the nationals of different states was epigamia, an arrangement by which the offspring of marriage were treated as citizens of the wife's polis if the husband settled there, and so was the husband. Athens, for example, granted epigamia to Euboea as late as the 5th century, a time when Athenian citizenship was fiercely protected. There are still earlier instances. Usually one hears of epigamia when for one reason or another it was being suspended or denied. Thus, there was an early arrangement between the islands of Andros and Paros, which Plutarch says ended when relations went sour. More interesting is the statement, again by Plutarch, that there was no intermarriage between members of two of the villages or demes of Attica, Pallene, and Hagnus. Far from being evidence that these places were somehow originally separate states, the prohibition was more like a ban on endogamy. In other words, the two communities were regarded, like members of a family, as being too close to be allowed to intermarry. Thus, both marriage itself and prohibition of marriage were ways of defining the relations between communities, including communities within a single large state like Attica, and of keeping those relations friendly. One way in which ties of xenia and marriage can now be traced in detail is the scientific study of Greek personal names, because patterns of naming reflect social realities. Foreign names enter a city's name pool as a result of both formal connections and less formal ones, such as temporary residence. Such onomastic evidence, as it is called, can now be studied in bulk and in depth, thanks to the computer-aided publication of all known Greek personal names, most of them attested from inscriptions. The chief vehicle of interaction among polis, however, was through warfare and through the formal suspension or renunciation of warfare by means of heavily ritualized treaties. One of the most common words for such a treaty is spondai, which literally means libations to the guaranteeing gods. The earliest surviving inscriptional peace treaty for all time dates from the 6th century and was found at Olympia. Nonetheless, there were surely agreements to limit warfare over strips of boundary land before that date. Archaeology may offer unexpected help in this matter. It is possible and plausible that some frontier zones were by tacit or explicit agreement left fallow. One such zone seems to have been the remote Scuota Plain, which separates part of northern Attica from Boeotia. Preliminary surface survey, i.e., the estimation of settlement patterns by gathering of potsherds, carried out in and after 1985, suggests that it was, perhaps deliberately, left uncultivated in the archaic period. The Lelantine War. An important landmark in interstate military relations of the kind considered here was the Lelantine War. It was the earliest Greek war, after the mythical Trojan War, that had any claim to be considered general, in the sense that it involved distant allies on each side. Fought in perhaps the later 8th century between the two main communities of Euboea, Chalcis, and Eretria, it took its name from the fertile Lelantine plain, which separates the cities and includes the site of Lefkandi. It is an interesting modern suggestion that Lefkandi itself is the site of old Eretria, abandoned about 700 BCE in favor of the classical site Eretria at the east end of the plain, perhaps as a consequence of Eretria's defeat in the war. This theory, however, needs to account for Herodotus's statement that at the early 6th century entertainment of the suitors of Cleisthenes of Sicyon, there was one Lysanias from Eretria, then at the height of its prosperity. Other faraway Greek states were somehow involved in the war. On this point, Thucydides agrees with his great predecessor Herodotus. Thus, Samos supported Chalcis and Miletus, Eretria. Given Euboean priority in overseas settlement, it is natural to suppose that the links implied by the traditions about the Lelantine War were the result of Euboean overseas energy, but that energy would hardly have turned casual contacts into actual alliances without a preliminary network of guest friendships. Whether the oracle at Delphi took sides in the war, as a modern speculation has it, is less certain, though there is no doubt that, by some means wholly mysterious to the 21st century, Delphi often provided updated information about possible sites for settlement, and even, as over Cyrene, gave the original stimulus to the emigration. One can be more confident in denying the thoroughly anachronistic notion that the Lelantine War shows the existence of trade leagues at this early date. Religious amphictyonies are one thing, but trade leagues are quite another. The evidence, such as it is, suggests that early trade was carried on by entrepreneurial aristocratic individuals, who no doubt exploited their guest friendships and formed more such friendships during their travels. It is true, however, that such individuals tended to come from areas where arable land was restricted, and to this extent, it is legitimate to speak in a generic way of those areas as having in a sense a more commercially minded population than others. One example of such an area is the Lelantine Plain, an exceptionally good piece of land on a notably barren and mountainous, though large, island. Herodotus described one such trader from the later Archaic period, Sostratus of Aegina, a man of fabulous wealth. Then in the early 1970s, a remarkable inscription was found in Etruria, a dedication to Apollo in the name of Sostratus of Aegina. This discovery revealed that the source of his wealth was trade with Etruria and other parts of Italy. Aegina is an island whose estimated classical population of about 40,000 was supported by land capable of supporting only about 4,000. One may quarrel with the first figure as too large and the second figure as too pessimistic. It makes insufficient allowance for the possibilities of highly intensive land use. Even after adjustment, however, it is clear that Aegina needed to trade in order to live. It is not surprising to find Sostratus's home city of Aegina included among the Greek communities allowed to trade at Naucratis in Pharaonic Egypt. That arrangement is described by Herodotus, and the site has been explored archaeologically. Aegina was the only participating city of Greece proper, as opposed to places in the eastern Aegean. The later Archaic periods. The rise of the tyrants. Ephesus, Turkey, Temple of Artemis. Ephesus, Turkey, Temple of Artemis. Site of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, Turkey. Dealings with opulent Asian civilizations were bound to produce disparities in wealth, and hence social conflicts within the aristocracies of Greece. One function of institutions, such as guest friendship, was no doubt to ensure the maintenance of the charmed circle of social and economic privilege. This system, however, presupposed a certain stability, whereas the rapid escalation of overseas activity in and after the 8th century was surely disruptive in that it gave a chance, or at least a grievance, to outsiders with the right go-getting skills and motivation. Not that one should imagine concentration of wealth taking place in the form most familiar to the 21st century, namely coined money. Since 1951, the date of the earliest coinage has been fairly securely fixed at about 600 BCE. The crucial discovery was the excavation and scientific examination of the foundation deposit of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus in Anatolia. The first objects recognizably similar to coined money were found there at levels most scholars, there are few doubters, accept as securely dated. Coinage did not arrive in Greece proper until well into the 6th century. There were, however, other ways of accumulating precious metals besides collecting it in coined form. Gold and silver can be worked into cups, plates and vases, or just held as bar or bullion. There is no getting round the clear implication of two poems of Solon, early 6th century, that first, gold and silver were familiar metals, and second, wealth was now in the hands of arrivistes. The decline of the aristocracy. First state in which the old aristocratic order began to break up was Corinth. The Bacchiadi had exploited Corinth's geographic position, which was favorable in ways rivaled only by that of the two Euboean cities already discussed. Like Chalcis, which supervised sea traffic between southern Greece and Macedonia, but also had close links with Boeotia and Attica, Corinth controlled both a north-south route, the Isthmus of Corinth, in modern times pierced by the Corinth Canal, and an east-west route. This second route was exploited in a special way. Corinth had two ports, Lechium to the west on the Gulf of Corinth, and Cenchreae to the east on the Saronic Gulf. Between the two seas there was a haulage system involving a rightly famous engineering feat, the so-called Diolkos portage way. The Diolkos, which was excavated in the 1950s, was a line of grooved paving stones across which goods could be dragged for transshipment, probably not the merchant ships themselves, though there is some evidence that warships, which were lighter, were so moved in emergencies. There is explicit information that the Bacchiadi had profited hugely from the harbour dues. As the Greek world expanded its mental and financial horizons, other Corinthian families grew envious. The result was the first firmly datable and well-authenticated Greek tyranny, or one-man rule by a usurper. This was the tyranny of Cypselus, who was only a partial Bacchiad. Aristotle, in the 4th century, was to say that tyrannies arise when oligarchies disagree internally, and that analysis makes good sense in the Corinthian context. The evidence of an inscribed Athenian archon list, found in the 1930s and attesting a grandson of Cypselus in the 590s, settled an old debate about the date of Cypselus's coup. It must have happened about 650, a conclusion for which there is other evidence, rather than at the much later date indicated by an alternative tradition. Cypselus and his son Periander ruled until about 587 BCE. Periander's nephew and successor did not last long. Precisely what factor in 650 made possible the success of the partial outsider Cypselus is obscure. No Bacchiad foreign policy failure can be dated earlier than 650. General detestation for the Bacchiadi, however, is clear from an oracle preserved by Herodotus that predicts that Cypselus will bring dike, or justice, to Corinth after the rule of the power-monopolizing Bacchiadi. No doubt this oracle was fabricated after the event, but it is interesting as showing that nobody regretted the passing of the Bacchiadi. Changes in warfare. Modern scholars have tried to look for more general factors behind Cypselus's success than a desire in a new world of wealth and opportunity to put an end to Bacchiad oppressiveness and exclusivity. One much-favored explanation is military, but it must be said straight away that the specific evidence for support of Cypselus by a newly emergent military class is virtually non-existent. The background to military change, a change whose reality is undoubted, needs a word. Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1st edition, Map of Europe. Maury from Britannica. History of Europe, Greeks. Aristocratic warfare, as described in the Homeric epics, puts much emphasis on individual prowess. Great warriors used chariots almost as a kind of taxi service to transport themselves to and from the battlefield, where they fought on foot with their social peers. The winner gained absolute power over the person and possessions of the vanquished, including the right to carry out ritual acts of corpse mutilation. The general picture is surely right, though it can be protested that Homer's singling out of individuals may be just literary spotlighting, and that the masses played a respectably large part in the fighting described in the epics. There is some force in that objection, and in the converse and related objection that in archaic and classical hoplite fighting individual duels were more prevalent than is allowed by scholars anxious to stress the collective character of hoplite combat. Still, a change in methods of fighting undoubtedly occurred in the course of the 7th century. The change was to a block system of fighting, in which infantry soldiers equipped with heavy armor or hopla, including helmet, breastplate, greaves, sword, spear, and a round shield attached to the left arm by a strap, fought, at least during part of an engagement, in something like coherent formation, each man's sword arm being guarded by the shield of the man on his right. This last feature produced a consequence commented on by Thucydides, namely, a tendency of the sword-bearer to drift to the right in the direction of the protection offered by his neighbor. For this reason, the best troops were posted on the far right to act as anchormen. The system, whose introduction is not commented on by any literary source, is depicted on vases in the course of the 7th century, though it is not possible to say whether it was a sudden technological revolution or something that evolved over decades. The second view seems preferable since the discovery in the 1950s of a fine bronze suit of heavy armor at Argos in a late 8th century context. Clearly, the change has social and political implications. Even when one acknowledges some continuation of individual skirmishing, much nonetheless depended on neighbors in the battle line standing their ground. An oath sworn by Athenian military recruits, epheboi, in the 4th century includes clauses about not disgracing the sacred weapons, not deserting comrades, and not handing down a diminished fatherland to posterity. The oath and the word epheb are 4th century, but the institutionalizing of hoplite obligations and expectations is surely much older. Early land warfare can, in fact, be thought of as a symbolic expression of the Greek city's identity. This helps to explain the strong ritual elements in a hoplite battle, which typically began with a sacrifice and taking of omens and ended with victory dedications, often of bronze suits of armor, in some appropriate sanctuary. It is above all the heavily armed troops, not the lightly armed or the sailors in the fleet, nor even the cavalry, who were thought of as in a special sense representing the classical polis. Thus, at classical Athens, the 10-tribe citizen system determined the organization of the hoplite army, but is much less important in the manning of the fleet. The influential hoplite theory of the origin of tyranny seeks to explain one general phenomenon of the 7th century, namely, the beginning of tyranny, by reference to another, the introduction of hoplite weapons and tactics with their greater emphasis on a collective, corporatist ethos. Insofar as both phenomena represent reactions against aristocratic rule, it is reasonable loosely to associate the two, but it is important to realize that the theory, however seductive, is in its strict form a modern construction. In the first place, the connection is never made by intelligent ancient writers interested both in the mechanics and psychology of hoplite warfare on the one hand and in tyranny on the other. Thucydides, for instance, a military historian if ever there was one, saw tyranny primarily in economic terms. Aristotle does indeed say that the extension of the military base of a state is liable to produce a widening of the political franchise, but this comment has nothing specifically to do with tyranny. He explains tyranny elsewhere either as resulting from splits within oligarchies or by an anachronistic 4th century reference to demagogic leadership, which, when combined with generalship, is liable to turn into tyranny. There he is surely thinking above all of Dionysius I of Syracuse. In the second place, it is discouraging for the hoplite theory that there is so little support for it in the best attested case, that of Cypselid Corinth. Attempts have indeed been made to get around the natural implication of the evidence, but they are not convincing. For instance, the ancient statement that Cypselus had no bodyguard ought to be given its natural meaning, which is a denial of the military factor. It ought not to be ingeniously twisted so as to imply that he did not need a bodyguard because, it is argued, he had the support of identifiable army groups. Furthermore, although it is true that Cypselus is called polemarch, which ought to mean a leader in war, it is suspicious that his activities in this capacity were entirely civil and judicial. Suspicion increases when one notes that polemarch was indeed the title of a magistrate in classical Athens. The early tyrannies. Greek expansion. Greek expansion, 9th-6th centuries BC. Other tyrannies are equally resistant to general explanations, except by circularity of reasoning. The Corinthian tyranny has been treated first in the present section because its dates are secure. There is, however, a more shadowy figure Phaedon of Argos, who may have a claim to be earlier still, and who has also been invoked as an exemplification of the military factor in the earliest tyrannies. Unfortunately, one ancient writer, Pausanias, puts him in the 8th century, while Herodotus puts him in the 6th. Most modern scholars amend the text of Pausanias and re-identify Herodotus's Phaedon as the grandson of the great man. This allows them to put Phaedon the tyrant in the 7th century and to associate him with a spectacular Argive defeat of Sparta at Hyceae in 669 BCE. His success is then explained as the product of the newly available hoplite method of fighting. The 8th century suit of armor from Argos would in fact allow the connection between Phaedon and hoplites even without discarding Pausanias. That construction assumes much that needs to be proved, and the hoplite theory is in fact being invoked in order to give substance to Phaedon rather than Phaedon lending independent support to the theory. It is a further cause for disquiet that some of the detail in the literary tradition about Phaedon is suspiciously suggestive of the 4th century. Thus, Aristotle's statement that Phaedon was a king who became a tyrant is strikingly appropriate for Philip II of Macedon, who built up his military autocracy from a hereditary base of a traditional sort, and whose dynasty did in fact interestingly claim Argive origins and thus regarded Phaedon as an ancestor. Two other tyrannies date securely from the 7th century and perhaps happened in imitation of Cypselus. Both arose in states immediately adjoining Corinth. Thegenes of Megara makes an appearance in history for 3 reasons. He slaughtered the flocks of the rich, an action incomprehensible without more background information than is available. He tried about 630 to help his son-in-law Cylon to power at Athens, and he built a fountain house that can still be seen off the road of the Spring House in modern Megara. The last 2 items reveal something interesting about the social and cultural character of established tyrannies, but none of the 3 offers much support for the military or any other general theory of the cause of tyranny. At Sicyon, the Orthogorid tyranny, whose most splendid member was the early 6th century Cleisthenes, may have exploited the Antidorianism already noted as a permanent constituent of the mentality of some Greeks. But since the relevant action, a renaming of tribes, falls in the time of Cleisthenes himself, it is no help with the problem of why the first Sicyonian tyrant came to power at all. In any case, the main object of Cleisthenes' dislike seems to have been not Dorians in general, but Argos in particular. The renaming is said to have been done to spite the Argives. Notwithstanding the skepticism of what has been said above, some solid general points can be made about the tyrannies mentioned. Athens and Sparta followed peculiar paths of development and must be treated separately. First, those tyrannies have more in common than their roughly 7th century dates. Several of the most famous are situated around or near the Isthmus of Corinth. That surely suggests a partly geographic explanation. That is, there was an influx of new and subversive notions alongside the purely material goods that arrived at this central zone. Places with a more stagnant economic and social life, such as Boeotia and Thessaly, neither colonized nor experienced tyrannies. In fact, some version of Thucydides' economic account of the rise of tyranny may be right, though there too, as with the origins of the city-state or the motives behind acts of colonization, one must be prepared to accept that different causes work for different states and to allow for the simple influence of fashion and contagion. Reflection on the places that avoided tyrannies leads to the second general point. Another way of looking at tyranny is to concentrate on its rarity and seek explanations for that. After all, there were hundreds of Greek states, many of them extremely small, which, as far as is known, never had tyrannies. The suggested explanation is that in places with small populations, there was enough scope for office holding by most of the city's ambitious men to make it unnecessary for any of them to aspire to a tyranny. One can add that certain places are known to have taken positive steps to ensure that regular office did not become a stepping stone to tyranny. For example, a very early constitutional inscription shows that 7th century Drerus on Crete prohibited tenure of the office of Cosmos, a local magistracy, until 10 years had elapsed since a man's last tenure. That is a refreshing approach and surely contains some truth. Nonetheless, the qualification, as far as is known, is important. With regard to many places, there is no better reason for saying that they avoided tyranny than for saying that they had it. Moreover, the view that tyranny was widespread may indeed be a misconception, although if so, it was an ancient one. Thucydides himself says that tyrannies were established in many places. Finally, the psychological argument from satisfaction of ambition is only partly compelling. It was surely more rewarding in every way to be a tyrant than to be a Dreran Cosmos. Sparta and Athens. Sparta. The distinctiveness of Sparta. Prominent among the states that never experienced tyranny was Sparta, a fact remarked on even in antiquity. It was exceptional in that, and in many other respects, some of which have already been noted. It sent out few colonies, only to Tarentum in southern Italy in the 8th century, and in the prehistoric period, to the Aegean islands of Thera and Melos. It was unfortified and never fully Sinosized in the physical sense. And it succeeded, exceptionally among Greek states, in subduing a comparably sized neighbor by force and holding it down for centuries. The neighbor was Messenia, which lost its independence to Sparta in the 8th century and did not regain it until the 360s. It was the Messenian factor, above all, that determined the peculiar development of Sparta, because it forced Spartans to adjust their institutions to deal with a permanently hostile subject population. Despite Sparta's military prominence among Greek states, which is the primary fact about it, Sparta's development is especially difficult to trace. That is so partly because there are few archaic or classical Spartan inscriptions. Even more important, there is very little genuine Spartan history written by Spartans. There was no Spartan Herodotus or Thucydides, though both men were deeply fascinated by Sparta, as indeed were most Greeks. And partly it is so because, a related point, invented tradition had been particularly active at Sparta. As early as the 5th century one finds laconizers in other states. The word derives from Laconia, the name for the Spartan state, or Lacedaemon, and signifies cultural admiration for Sparta and its institutions. The Spartan tradition in European thought can be traced through the centuries up to modern times, though it has never amounted to a single, easily definable set of ideas. In the intellectual world of the 4th century BCE, when many of the most significant myths about Sparta seem to have been concocted, Sparta, chiefly under the influence of idealist philosophers seeking some solution to civic disorder, was virtually turned into a shorthand expression for a pure community free from stasis, internal dissension and fighting, with equality of land ownership and other utopian features that never existed in the historical Sparta or anywhere else. In the Roman period, Sparta had become a tourist attraction, a place of uncouth, half-invented rituals. This was also the period when Sparta the living legend consciously traded on and exported fantasies about its great past. In the Hellenistic first book of Maccabees, one even finds the idea seriously put forward that the Jews and Spartans were somehow kin. If more is said about Athens than about Sparta in the present section, that is not because Athens was intrinsically more important, but because the amount of usable evidence about it is incomparably greater. By way of compensation for the lack of evidence about Sparta, there are two items of cardinal importance: an extraordinary document about the early Spartan constitution and state, preserved by the Greek writer Plutarch, the Great Rhetor, and the poetry of the 7th century Spartan poet Tyrtaeus. Tyrtaeus wrote poetry in elegiac couplets, alternating hexameter and pentameter lines, intended for symposia. Much of it is military in character and enshrines the hoplite ethic in a developed form at a time when Sparta and Argos were at each other's throats. A fragment of Tyrtaeus's poetry, published in 1980, definitely disproved modern skepticism about whether Sparta and Argos could have confronted each other militarily as early as the 660s. Sparta had two kings, or basileis. If it is right that this title merely denotes hereditary nobles with stated prerogatives, this was originally one of its less remarkable aspects. It is odd, however, that the number 2 should have been so permanently entrenched. In other respects, the Sparta that emerged from the Dark Age had many standard features, such as a warrior assembly based on communal eating in messes, syssitia, a system analogous to the symposium system, and a council of elders. Magistrates called ephors were unique to Sparta and its offshoots, but there is nothing intrinsically odd about formal magistracies. The Rhetra. The Rhetra is an alleged response by the Delphic oracle to the lawgiver Lycurgus around the 9th or 8th century BCE. The Rhetra purports to define the powers of the various Spartan groups and individuals just mentioned. It begins, however, by saying that the tribes must be tribed or retained. The Greek is a kind of pun, and the obes, a word for a locality, must be obbed. The meaning there is desperately obscure, but in an 8th century context, it ought to refer to some kind of political synocism. Sparta, as stated, was never physically synocised. The tribes and obes must be the units of civic organization. The Rhetra demands the setting up of a council with the kings and stipulates regular meetings for the assembly, something not attested at Athens until far later. A crucial final clause seems to say firmly that the people, or damos, shall have the power. Yet a rider to the Rhetra, associated with the late 8th century kings Theopompus and Polydorus, says that, if the people choose crookedly, the elders and kings shall be dissolvers. A poem of Tyrtaeus's has traditionally been thought to echo both parts of that document, rider as well as Rhetra, but that relationship has recently been challenged. Certainly, there is some circularity in the usual reconstructions of one crucial corrupt line of the relevant poem. The Rhetra is a precocious constitutional document, if it really dates to the 9th or early 8th century, and for that and other reasons, Delphi was not active, and writing was not common much before the middle of the 8th century. It is common practice to date the whole document or pair of documents a century or two later. On this view, which is not here followed, the Rhetra itself, with its stipulation of powers for the hoplite damos, is a 7th century manifestation of hoplite assertiveness. In fact, it represents a kind of Spartan alternative to tyranny. The references to tribes and obes are then seen as part of a reform of the citizen body and of the army, comparable to, and not much earlier than tribal changes elsewhere, see below the reforms of Cleisthenes. The rider then dates from an even later period, when Spartan military reverses called for a reactionary readjustment of the balance of power. That view, which involves downdating Theopompus and Polydorus to the 7th century from the 8th, and still more arbitrarily attributing to them the activity presupposed by the Rhetra rather than the rider, does too much violence to the best chronological evidence, that of Thucydides and Herodotus, and a view in terms of 8th century political cynicism should be preferred. As for the alleged army reform, nothing can be said about it in detail. The best reconstruction is hardly more than a creative fabrication from Hellenistic evidence that dealt with a Spartan religious festival, but had nothing straightforwardly to do with the army at all. The Helot facto. It was definitely in the 8th century that Sparta took the step which was to make it unique among Greek states. It had already in the Dark Age coerced into semisubject or perioikic status a number of its more immediate neighbors. Then in the second half of the 8th century, it undertook the wholesale conquest of Messenia, c. 735–715. One consequence, already noted, was the export of an unwanted group, the Parthenii, to Taras. These were sons of Spartan mothers and non-Spartan fathers, procreated during the absence in Messenia of the Spartan warrior elite. A still more important consequence of the conquest of Messenia, good to plough and good to hoe, as Tyrtaeus put it, was the acquisition of a large tract of fertile land and the creation of a permanently servile labor force, the Helots, as the conquered Messenians were now called. The Helots were state slaves, held down by force and fear. A 7th century revolt by the Messenians, the Second Messenian War, was put down only after decades of fighting and with the help, surely, of the new hoplite tactics. The relationship of hatred and exploitation, the Helots handed over half of their produce to Sparta, was the determining feature in Spartan internal life. Spartan warrior peers, homoi, were henceforth subjected to a rigorous military training, the agoge, to enable them to deal with the Messenian Helots, whose agricultural labors provided the Spartans with the leisure for their military training and lifestyle, a notoriously vicious circle. The agoge and the Sparta that it produced can best be understood comparatively by reference to the kind of male initiation ceremonies and rituals found in other warrior societies. Up to the Second Messenian War, Sparta's political institutions and cultural life had been similar to those in other states. It had an artistic tradition of its own and produced or gave hospitality to such poets as Alcman, Terpander, and Tyrtaeus. But now Spartan institutions received a new, bleak military orientation. Social sanctions like loss of citizen status were the consequence of cowardice in battle. A system of homosexual pair bonding maintained the normal hoplite bonds at a level of ferocious intensity, and the economic surplus provided by the lots of land worked by the helots was used to finance the elite institution of the syssitia, with loss of full citizen status for men who could not meet their mess bill. The agoge, however, transformed Sparta and set it apart from other states. The difficulties of reconstructing the details of the agoge are acute. Invented tradition has been unusually busy in that area, but a recent investigator goes too far in seeing the agoge as the work of the 3rd century Stoic philosopher Sphaerus. The Greek historian Xenophon in the 4th century allows us to glimpse the essentials. The helot factor affected more than Sparta's internal life. Again and again, modifications were forced on Sparta in the sphere of foreign policy. The Spartans could not risk frequent military activity far from home, because this would entail leaving behind a large population of discontented helots who outnumbered Spartans by 7 to 1. A solution, occasionally tried by adventurous Spartan commanders, was selective enfranchisement of helots. Yet this called for nerve that even the Spartans did not have. On one occasion, 2,000 helots, who were promised freedom and were led garlanded round the temples, disappeared, and nobody ever found out what had happened to them. Some person or persons evidently had second thoughts. Xenophon, who was no enemy to Sparta, illuminated helot attitudes in his description of an episode called the Kinadon Affair, which happened at the very beginning of the 4th century. It was suppressed with ruthless and effective speed. The leader Kinadon, according to Xenophon, said that the rebel groups, among whom helots are listed in first place, would have liked to eat the Spartans raw, and incidents such as this one explain why. Attempts to minimize the importance of that episode as evidence for helot discontent should be firmly resisted. It is a question whether the tension should be seen as Messenian nationalism or as the expression of class struggle, but nationalism cannot be the whole story. One effect of the helot phenomenon was the brutalization of the Spartan elite itself. Spartan violence toward other Greeks, particularly taking the form of threats with or actual use of sticks, bacteriae, is attested with remarkable frequency in the sources, as is the resentment of such treatment by other Greeks. It seems that Spartans of the officer class had a habit of treating other Greeks like the helots, by whom they were outnumbered and surrounded at home, and the implied insult and humiliation was deeply resented. The arrogant use of a non-military weapon, such as a stick, actually added to the degradation. The Peloponnesian League. After the suppression of the Messenian revolt, perhaps not before 600, Sparta controlled much of the Peloponnese. In the 6th century, it extended that control further into Arcadia to the north, by diplomatic as well as by purely military means. On the diplomatic level, Sparta, the greatest of the Dorian states, deliberately played the anti-Dorian card in the mid-6th century in an attempt to win more allies. Sparta's Dorianism was unacceptable to some of its still independent neighbors, whose mythology remembered a time when the Peloponnese had been ruled by Achaean kings such as Atreus, Agamemnon, and his son Orestes, in a period modern scholars would call Mycenaean. The central symbolic act recorded by tradition was the talismanic bringing home to Sparta of the bones of Orestes himself, a way for Sparta to claim that it was the successor of the old line of Atreus. The result was an alliance with Arcadian Tegea, which in turn inaugurated a network of such alliances, to which has been given the modern name of the Peloponnesian League. A valuable 5th century inscription found in the 1970s concerning a community in Aetolia, north-central Greece, illuminated the obligations imposed by Sparta on its allies, above all full military reciprocity, i.e., the requirement to defend Sparta when it was attacked, with similar guarantees offered by Sparta in return. Another, more obviously pragmatic, reason why Sparta attracted to itself allies in areas like Arcadia was surely fear of Argos. Archaic and classical Argos never forgot the great age of Phaedon, and from time to time, the Argives tried to reassert a claim to hegemony in mythical terms of their own. One way of doing so was to back the claim of the Pisatans rather than the Eleans to run the Olympic Games. In the same period, the middle of the 6th century, Sparta drew on its enhanced prestige and popularity in the Peloponnese to take its antipathy to tyranny a stage further. A papyrus fragment of what looks like a lost history supports Plutarch's statement that Sparta systematically deposed tyrants elsewhere in Greece, the tyrannies in Sicyon, Naxos, and perhaps even the Cypselid at Corinth, though this may be a confusion for a similarly named community called Cerinthus on Euboea. The most famous deposition was Sparta's forcible ending of the tyranny at Athens. Finally, one must ask, however, what were Sparta's motives for those interventions? Perhaps part of the motive was genuine ideological dislike of tyranny. Sparta was to exploit this role as late as 431, when it entered the Great Peloponnesian War as would-be liberator of Greece from the new tyranny in Greece, namely the Athenian Empire. But that theory can be turned on its head. Perhaps the Spartans retrojected their antipathy to tyranny into the archaic period as a way of justifying their moral stance in the late 430s. Or Sparta may have been worried about the ambitions of Argos, with which certain tyrants, like the Athenian, had close connections. Or it may have long-sightedly detected sympathy on the part of certain tyrants toward the growing power of Persia. It is true that Sparta made some kind of diplomatic arrangement with the threatened Lydian power of the Anatolian ruler Croesus not long before his defeat by Persia in 546. If suspicion of Persia was behind the deposition of the tyrants, Sparta was inconsistent in carrying out its anti-Persian policy. It did not help Croesus in his final showdown with Persia, nor did it help anti-Persian elements on Samos, nor did it do much in the years immediately before the great Greek-Persian collision of 480–479 called the Persian War. It sent no help to the general rising of Ionia against Persia in 499 nor to Athens at the preliminary campaign of Marathon in 490. Inconsistency of diplomatic decision-making on the part of Sparta is, however, always explicable for a reason already noticed: its Helot problem. Athens of ancient Greek civilization. The distinctiveness of Athens. Athens was also highly untypical in many respects, though perhaps what is most untypical about it is the relatively large amount of evidence available both about Athens as a city and imperial center and about Attica, the territory surrounding and controlled by Athens. That element presents a particular difficulty when one attempts to pass judgment on the issue of typicality versus untypicality in ancient and especially archaic Greek history. It often is not known whether a given phenomenon is frequent or merely frequently attested. That kind of thing creates difficulties for what students of modern history call exceptionalist theories about particular states. Even at Athens, there is much that is not yet known. For instance, of the 139 villages, or demes, given a political definition by Cleisthenes in 508, only a handful have been properly excavated. First, it is safe to say that Attica's huge size and favorable configuration made it unusual by any standards among Greek polis. Its territory was far larger than that of Corinth or Megara, whereas Boeotia, though in control of a comparable area, resorted to the federal principle as a way of imposing unity. Like Corinth, but unlike Thebes, the greatest city of classical Boeotia, Athens had a splendid acropolis citadel that had its own water supply, a natural advantage making for early political centralization. And Athens was protected by 4 mountain systems offering a first line of defense. Second, Attica has a very long coastline jutting into the Aegean, a feature that invited it to become a maritime power. One may contrast it with Sparta, whose port of Gythion is far away to the south. That in turn was to compel Athens to import quantities of the shipbuilding timber it lacked, a major factor in Athenian imperial thinking. It helps to explain its 5th century interest in timber-rich Italy, Sicily, and Macedon. Third, although Attica was rich in certain natural resources, such as precious metal for coinage, the silver of the Laurium mines in the east of Attica, and marble for building, its soil, suitable though it is for olive growing, is thin by comparison with that of Thessaly or Boeotia. That meant that when Athens's territory became more densely populated after the post-Mycenaean depopulation, which had affected all Greece, it had to look for outside sources of grain, and to secure those sources, it had to act imperialistically. Some scholars have attempted to minimize Athens's dependence on or need for outside sources of grain, and to bring down the date at which it began to draw on the granaries of southern Russia via the Black Sea, as it definitely did in the 4th century. Certainly, there were fertile areas of Attica proper, for instance near Marathon, and at many periods Athens directly controlled some politically marginal but economically productive areas, such as the Oropus district to the north or the island of Lemnos. A case can also be made for saying that if Athenians had been prepared to eat less wheat and more barley, Athens could have fed itself. Real needs, however, are sometimes less important than perceived needs, and for the understanding of Athenian imperial actions, it is more important that its politicians believed, even if modern statisticians would say they were wrong, that internal sources of grain must be endlessly supplemented from abroad. Nor is it entirely plausible to dissociate Athens's 7th century acquisition of Sygium from the provisioning possibilities of the Black Sea region. Theseus slaying the Minotaur. Theseus slaying the Minotaur. Theseus slaying the Minotaur, detail of a vase, Stamnos, painting by the Cleophrades painter, 6th century BCE, in the British Museum. Unlike the Peloponnese, with its tradition of Dorian invasion from the north, Athens claimed to be autochthonous, that is, its inhabitants had occupied the same land forever. Like any such claim, it was largely fiction, but it helped to make up for Athens's relative poverty in religion and myth. It has nothing to compare with the great legends of Thebes, the Oedipus story, or the Peloponnese Heracles, the house of Atreus. There was one hero, however, who could be regarded as specially Athenian, and that was Theseus, to whom the original political cynicism of Attica was attributed even by a hard-headed writer like Thucydides. At whatever date one puts this Thessian cynicism or centralization, perhaps 900 would be safe. It seems that the late Dark Age in Attica saw the opposite process taking place at the physical level. That is, the villages and countryside of Attica were in effect colonized from the center in the course of the 8th century. The process may not have been complete until even later. That explains why Athens was not one of the earliest colonizing powers. The possibility of internal colonization within Attica itself was like Sparta's expansion into Messenia, an insurance against the kind of short-term food shortages that forced such places as Corinth and Thera to siphon off part of their male population. In fact, Athens did acquire one notable overseas possession as early as 610 BCE, the city of Sygium on the way to the Black Sea. Yet as long as its neighbor Megara controlled Salamis, a large and strategically important island in the Saronic Gulf, the scope for long-distance Athenian naval operations was restricted. The excellent tripartite natural harbor of Piraeus was not safe for use until Salamis was firmly Athenian. Until then, Athens had to make do with the more open and less satisfactory port facilities of Phalerum, roughly in the region of the modern airport. Thus, there was an obvious brake on naval expansion. By the later 7th century then, Athens was looking abroad, and it is not surprising to find it experiencing some of the strains that in the 8th century had led to tyrannies elsewhere. Indeed, it narrowly escaped a first attempt at tyranny itself, that of Cylon, the Olympic victor, 630s. The close connection between athletic success and military values has been noted. There was an equally close connection between athletic and political achievement, and not just in the archaic age. Cylon was helped by his father-in-law Thegenes of Megara, a fact that underlines, as does Megarian possession of Salamis until the 6th century, the lateness of Athens's growth to great power status. Classical Megara was a place of small consequence. That Cylon's attempt was a failure is interesting, but too little is known about his potential following to prove either that Athenian tyranny was an idea whose time had not yet come, or that there is social and economic significance merely in the fact of his having made the attempt. Cylon's attempt had two consequences for Athenian history. The first is certain but fortuitous. Cylon's followers were put to death in a treacherous and sacrilegious way, which was held to have incriminated his killers, notably Megacles, a member of the Alcmeonid Genos. Pollution attracted in this way is a slippery conception. It could wake or sleep, as Aeschylus put it. That particular pollution adhered even to persons who were not on their father's side members of the Alcmeonid Genos, such as the great 5th century leader Pericles, and was usually woken up for deliberate and political ends. The other consequence may not be a consequence at all, but a coincidence in time. It was not many years after the Cylon affair that the Athenian lawgiver Draco gave the city its first comprehensive law code, perhaps 621. Because of the code's extreme harshness, Draco's name has become a synonym for legal savagery. But the code, the purely political features of which are irrecoverably lost to the present short of some lucky inscriptional find, was surely intended to define and so ameliorate conditions. The Athenian equivalents of the bribe-eating basileis of the Boeotian Hesiod's poem could still dispense a rough, but no longer arbitrary, justice. Further than that, it is not safe to go. Draco's code, like that of the statesman and poet Solon, c. 630–560, was destroyed by anti-democrats in the late 5th century. A detailed constitution foisted on Draco has survived in the treatise called the Constitution of Athens, attributed to Aristotle and found on papyrus in 1890. That document says much about the psychology of 411 BCE and little about the situation in 621. Solon of ancient Greek civilization. Solon. Whatever the connection between Cylon and Draco, and one must beware the trap of bringing all the meager facts about the archaic period into relation with each other. Firmer grounds for postulating economic and social unrest in late 7th century Attica are to be found in the poetry of Solon. Solon is the first European politician who speaks to the 21st century in a personal voice. Tyrtaeus reflects an ethos and an age. Like the other archaic poets mentioned, Solon wrote for symposia, and his more frivolous poetry should not be lost sight of in preoccupation with what he wrote in self-justification. He was a man who enjoyed life and wanted to preserve rather than destroy. Solon's laws, passed in 594, were an answer to a crisis that has to be reconstructed largely from his response to it. Most scholars believe that Solon's laws continued to be available for consultation in the 5th and 4th centuries, that, as noted above, did not prevent distortion and manipulation. In any case, by the 4th century, the age of treatises like the Constitution of Athens and other works by local historians of Attica, its hydrographers, much about early Attica had been forgotten or was misunderstood. Above all, there was a crucial failure to understand the dependent status of those who worked on the land of Attica before Solon abolished that status, which was conceived of as a kind of obligation or debt. This abolition, or shaking off of burdens, was the single most important thing Solon did. When one divides Solon's work, as will be done here for convenience, into economic, political, and social components, one may fail to grasp the possibility that there was a unified vision organizing it all, and that in this sense, no one reform was paramount. Perhaps the poem of Solon that sums up best what he stood for is a relatively neglected and not easily elucidated one, but an important one nonetheless, in which he seems to claim that nobody else could have done what he did and still have kept the cream on the milk. That is to say, his was, in intention at least, a more just though still a stratified society that sought to retain the cooperation of its elite. Solon cancelled all debt, as stated, that cannot yet have been debt incurred in a monetary form. He also abolished enslavement for debt, pulling up the boundary markers, or horoi, which indicated some sort of obligation. The act of pulling up the horoi was a sign that he had freed the black earth. The men whose land was designated by those horoi were called Spartas, hectomore, because they had to hand over 1/6 of their produce to the few, or the rich, to whom they were in some sense indebted. Solon's change was retrospective as well as prospective. He brought back people from overseas slavery who no longer spoke the Attic language. This is the evidence, hinted at above, for thinking that the problems facing Solon went back at least a generation into the period of Draco or even Cylon. Enslavement for debt was not an everyday occurrence in the world of Aristotle or Plutarch, although the concept never entirely disappeared in antiquity, and they seem to have misunderstood the nature of the debt or obligation that the horror indicated. It is not only Aristotle and Plutarch who found the situation bewildering. It has seemed odd to modern scholars that mere defaulting on a conventional debt should result in loss of personal freedom. Hence they have been driven to the hypothesis that land in archaic Greece was in a strong sense inalienable and thus not available as security for a loan of perhaps seed corn or other goods in kind. Only the person of the debtor and members of his family could be put up as a kind of security. Incurable damage has, however, been done to this general theory by the independent dismantling of any idea that land in archaic Greece was in fact inalienable. Such Greek prohibitions on alienation, as one hears of, tend to date from late and semi-mythical contexts, such as the 4th century literary reworking of tradition about Sparta, or from post-archaic colonial contexts, where the object of equal and indivisible land portions was precisely to avoid the injustices and agricultural buying up and asset stripping left behind at home. Evidently then, some new approach is needed, and it can be found in the plausible idea that what Solon got rid of was something fundamentally different from ordinary debt. In fact, hectomorage was a kind of originally voluntary contractual arrangement whereby the small man gave his labor to the great man of the area, forfeiting 1/6 of his produce and symbolically recognizing this subordination by accepting the installation of a horos on the land. In return, the other perhaps provided physical protection. This would go back historically to the violent and uncertain Dark Age when Attica was being resettled, and there was danger from cattle rustlers, pirates. Nowhere in Attica is far from the sea, or just greedy neighbors. Alternatively, hectomorage may simply have been the contractual basis on which powerful men assigned land to cultivators in the 9th and 8th centuries, when Attica was being reclaimed after the previous impoverished period. As the 7th century wore on, however, there was scope in Attica for enrichment of an entirely new sort, involving concentration of precious metal in marketable or at least exchangeable form as a result of contacts with elegant, rich, and sophisticated new worlds across the sea, that produced more violent disparities of wealth and a motive for cashing the value of a defaulting laborer. On his part, the laborer may have felt that his low social status, once acceptable or inevitable, was no longer commensurate with his military value in the new hoplite age. So Solon's abolition of hectomorage was as much a social and political as an economic change. That theory of the origin of hectomorage is attractive and explains much. It is disconcerting, however, that the best analogies that can be offered for such semi-contractual servitude for debt are from older hierarchical civilizations dependent on highly organized exploitation of man-made irrigation systems, so-called hydraulic economies. It is hard to see who or what institution in geometric Attica had the authority, in the absence of any kind of priest-king, to impose the hectomorage system generally throughout the large area of Attica. Nonetheless, one can accept that hectomorage was as much a matter of status as of economic obligation. Solon's main political changes were first to introduce a council of 400 members alongside the old Thessian council of elders known as the Areopagus, from the hill of Ares next to the Acropolis, where it met. The functions of this new council of Solon are uncertain, but that is no reason to doubt its historicity. Solon's council is perhaps important not so much for itself as for what it anticipated, the replacement council of 500, introduced by Cleisthenes at the end of the 6th century. Second, Solon allowed appeal to the Heliaea, or popular law court. The composition of this body is the subject of fierce scholarly dispute. One view sees it as a new and wholly separate body of sworn jurors, enjoying even at this date a kind of sovereignty within the state. The more usual view is that the Heliaea was the assembly in its judicial capacity. The latter view is preferable. Neither in Solon's time nor later is it plausible to posit large juries whose makeup or psychology was distinct from that of the political assembly. In later times, such appeal to the people was regarded as particularly democratic. But that is just the kind of anachronism one must be careful of when estimating Solon. Until pay for juries was introduced in the 460s, such juries could not be a buttress of democracy. Moreover, it would take a courageous peasant, there were no professional lawyers or speechwriters as yet, to get up and articulately denounce a bribe-swallowing Basilius, especially if, as seems possible, unsuccessful appeal could actually result in increase of sentence. Third, Solon admitted to the assembly the lowest economic class in the Athenian state, the Thetes, whose status was henceforth defined in terms of agricultural produce. The quotes are necessary because investing such fixed economic statuses, or tele, with political significance was an innovation of Solon himself. That is, his fourth political reform was to make eligibility for all political office, not just the bare right of attending the assembly, dependent on wealth, and no longer exclusively on birth, a timocratic, rather than an aristocratic system. Solon's four classes were the 500-bushel men, or pentakosiomdimnoi, the hippes or cavalry class, the zeugetai or hoplites, and the thetes, the class that later provided most of the rowers for the fleet. Again, the immediate impact of the change need not have been cataclysmic. Many of the older aristocracy, whether or not one should think of them as a closely defined group of eupatridae, that is, people of good descent, would still have been eligible for office even after the change. But there was also a need to cater to men who were outsiders in the technical sense of not belonging to the older gene. The name of one such excluded but high-status category of families has perhaps come down to the present, the so-called organs. Nor were Solon's four classes themselves entirely new, as indeed the constitution of Athens actually admits in an aside. Thus there were horsemen and even hoplites before Solon, and thetes are mentioned in Homer. The phrase 500-bushel men, which at first sight looks like a prosaic and unimaginative new coinage, acquired in 1968 a 9th-century archaeological analogue. A set of 5 model granaries was found in a female grave excavated in the Agora. It clearly was a pre-Solonian status symbol. I was the daughter of a pentakosiomdimnos. An interesting suggestion sees the four classes as originally religious in character. Their members may have had allocated functions in the festivals of the Syno-sized Athenian state. This is not strictly provable, but is plausible because the political and military life of Athens and Attica was at all times seen in religious terms. Solon's social legislation seems generally designed to reduce the primacy of the family and increase that of the community or polis. To that extent, it can be regarded as embryonically democratic. For instance, his laws on inheritance made it easier to leave property away from the family. He also legislated to restrict ostentatious mourning at funerals and to prevent spectacular burials, aggressive funerals, as they were called by one modern Marxist authority, which were potentially a way for aristocratic families to assert their prestige. And not just a potential way either. A great noble called Cimon was buried later in the 6th century in true Lefkandi style, that is, close to the horses with which he had won 3 times at the Olympic Games. That burial was surely in defiance of the Solonian rules. As can be seen from the Antigone of the 5th century tragic poet Sophocles, death and funerary ritual were always an area in which the family, and especially the women, had traditional functions. For the state to seek to regulate them was a major shift of emphasis. The whole thrust of Solon's reforms was to define and enlarge the sphere of activity of the polis. He was concerned to recognize and increase the power of the ordinary Athenian thete and hoplite, while containing without destroying the privileges of the aristocratic cream. By uprooting the hore, symbols of a kind of slavery, he created the Attica of independent smallholders, one encounters as late as the 4th century. and he gave them political rights to match, as much as was sufficient, as a poem of his puts it. One result of Solon's reforms cannot have been intentional. The abolition of hectomorage created, in modern terms, a gap in the workforce. From then on, it was beneath the dignity of the emancipated Athenian to work for a master. Some other source of labor had to be found, and it was found in the form of chattel slaves from outside. That means that the whole edifice of culture and politics rested on the labor of men and women who by right of purchase or conquest had become mere things, mere domestic, agricultural or mining equipment, and whose presence in classical Attica rose into the tens of thousands. For by the 5th century, slave owning was not confined to the aristocratic few, but had been extended to the descendants of that very class Solon had liberated from another kind of slavery. Initially, the Solonian solution was an economic failure. However true it is to attribute to him the economic shape of classical Attica. Solon himself was almost, but not quite, a tyrant. The orthodox Greek tyrant was associated with redistribution of land and cancellation of debts, though this association was to a large extent a mere matter of popular perception, because wholesale redistribution of land is extraordinarily rare in Greek history. Solon did cancel debts. He also redistributed the land in the sense that the former hectomore now had control without encumbrance of the land they had previously worked with strings attached. He did not, however, redistribute all the land, because he left the rich in possession of the land the hectomore had previously worked for them. In this respect, Solon's rule differed from tyranny. It also differed in his simple avoidance of the word. After his year of legislative activity, he simply disappeared, instead of supervising the implementation of that legislation. That was unfortunate for the former hectomore, who needed to be supported in the early years. Growing olive trees, which were a staple of Attica, was an obvious recourse for the farmer in new possession of his own plot, but it takes 20 years for olive trees to reach maturity. Such farmers could hardly look for charity to their former masters, whose wealth and privilege Solon had curtailed. Instead, they looked to a real tyrant, Pisistratus. The Pisistratid tyranny. It took more than one attempt to establish the Pisistratid tyranny, but in its long final phase, it lasted from 546 to 510. After the death of Pisistratus, the tyrant's son Hippias ruled from 527 to 510 with the assistance, if not co-rule, of his brother Hipparchus, who was assassinated in 514. Hostility to the tyrants on the part of 5th century informants like Herodotus makes it difficult to ascertain the truth about them. That they ruled with the acquiescence of the great nobles of Attica is suggested by a 5th century Archon list discovered in the 1930s, which shows that even the post-Pisistratid reformer Cleisthenes, a member on his father's side of what Herodotus calls the tyrant-hatting Alcmeonid Genos, was Archon in the 520s. It is also suggested by the fact that Miltiades, a relative of the gorgeously buried Cimon, went out to govern an outpost in the Thracian Chersonese, hardly against the wishes of the tyrants. Furthermore, even the Pisistratids did not confiscate property indiscriminately, though they did levy a tax of 5%. That tax enabled them to redistribute wealth to those who now needed it, that is, those who had joined him through poverty after having their debts removed by Solon. Although a formally ambiguous expression, it must in common sense apply to pre-Solonian debtors, not creditors. Pisistratus. Pisistratus, copper engraving, 1832. How far Pisistratus, who seems to have started as a leader of one geographic faction, specifically mobilized hoplite support at the outset is uncertain, but such military backing is a little more plausible in his century than in the mid-7th century when the Isthmus tyrants were seizing power. Pisistratus's position was, however, buttressed by bodyguards. Here, for once, is a tyrant who in some ways fits Aristotle's otherwise excessively 4th century model. In any case, Pisistratus's introduction of deme judges, that is, judges who traveled round the villages of Attica dispensing something like uniform justice, was an important leveling step, both socially and geographically, and one should imagine that as an appeal to the goodwill of the hoplite and thetic classes. It also, in the longer term, anticipated, as did the well-attested road-building activity of the Pisistratids, the unification of Attica, which Cleisthenes was to carry much further. Whether or not Pisistratus climbed to power with hoplite help, he surely strengthened Athens militarily in a way that must have involved hoplites. Indeed, the Pisistratid period ought to count as one of unequivocal military and diplomatic success, and literary suggestions otherwise should be discounted as products of aristocratic malice. In that period should be put the first firm evidence of the tension between Athens and Sparta that was to determine much of classical Greek history, namely, Athenian alliances not just with Sparta's enemy Argos, but in 519 with Boeotian Plataea. Plataeans, faced with coercion from their bigger neighbor Thebes, sued for this alliance at the prompting of Sparta itself. This, however, is evidence of, among other things, Spartan-Athenian hostility because Sparta's motive, it was said, was to stir up trouble between Thebes and Athens. Moreover, it may have been in the Pisistratid period that the sanctuary of Eleusis, near Athens's western border and always important for defensive and offensive, as well as for purely religious reasons, was fortified. But that is controversial.